Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us bright and early here, and hope you had a good night out at the restaurants and back in Loyola. So it's with great enthusiasm this morning that I introduce you to Dr. Mark Potter. He's a colleague that I first met over 2 decades ago, and a man who I have deeply respected ever since. Dr. Potter is a faculty member teaching religion at Newton Country Day School of the Society of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Sister Barbara Rogers, who's the head of Newton Country Day School and happens to be a board member here at Holy Cross, describes Mark as someone who has distinguished himself among our students as a man deeply devoted to social justice and social responsibility. Mission-driven, world-focused, warm and practical, his students and his colleagues find in him a person who helps them imagine the possible. Dr. Potter studied at Fairfield University and the University of Chicago and received a doctorate in theological ethics from Boston College. His academic work centers on the development of solidarity in the Catholic social tradition. For 10 years, he served as the director of social justice ministries with the Jesuits in the Western U.S., where he was a resource and catalyst for social justice efforts among Jesuit high schools, universities, and parishes. In this role with the Jesuits, Mark worked to promote commitments to fundamental human rights among some of the world's most ethically challenged corporations, and was instrumental in the creation of the Jesuit Restorative Justice Initiative that sought to change both the culture and the laws that sentence juvenile offenders to death in prison. Most relevant to our conference theme, Mark played a founding role in the Kino Border Initiative, which is an amazing organization that I had the opportunity to visit last year myself, and that you'll hear more about in the upcoming hour. He continues to support KBI as a member of the Emeritus Board of Directors and a spokesperson for immigration reform. Prior to working with the Jesuit province, Dr. Potter worked at Loyola Marymount University's Center for Service and Action, where he directed alternative breaks, supported faculty in developing community-based learning courses, and taught a course on Latin American liberation theology. Mark has spent extended periods of time in Peru, Bolivia, Nicaragua, El Salvador, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Mexico, and Poland. He now lives in Newton, Massachusetts with his wife, Kristen Heyer, a professor of theology at Boston College, and their 2 sons. On a personal note, I was thrilled when they recently moved back to the region, as I now get to regularly be inspired by their example of living a faith that does justice within our parish community of St. Ignatius, where I get the great fortune of seeing them regularly. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Potter.
Good morning, and thanks for having me here. I want to talk today a little bit about the Kino Border Initiative and some of the principles and kind of virtues or values that inspire the work of the KBI. And to do that, I'm going to first give a little context of what the Kino Border Initiative is. Then we're going to watch a 20-minute video put together by a center at Creighton University, their backpack journalism project, where they did a documentary about the Kino Border Initiative. And then I'm going to talk about those principles in specific. Then we'll have an opportunity for some Q&A. So first, the Kino Border Initiative was born in 2005, 2006, was a time in this country where there was a lot of debate about whether or not comprehensive immigration reform could happen. There were roughly, just as there are now, 11 to 12 million undocumented folks in the US. And it was a time that President George W. Bush at the time thought that was an opportune moment to bring people out of the shadows. And of course, there were several reasons driving this. One was the economics. When you have 11 or 12 million people in our country who are working off the books, it deflates the value of the products that they're working on, the labor. And they are also working in an underground economic labor system, and they're ripe for exploitation. So there was an economic reason for this emphasis on immigration reform. Also, there were concerns for national security. If you have 11 or 12 million people in the country coming in and out of the country somewhat regularly, then what does that say about the borders? That there are porous borders, we don't know who's coming in and out, and therefore we should be attentive to making sure that we can keep track of who's in our country and why. And post 9/11, that was a real, and that is a real concern. Partly, the emphasis on immigration reform in 2005 and 2006 was born out of civic concerns for communities. And certainly I saw this living and working in California, first in Los Angeles and then in Northern California in San Jose. A large percentage of the population in California and Arizona, those two states comprise, at the time, 25% of the country's undocumented population lived in California and Arizona. So every community was affected by the fact that a large number of people in the communities were there without documents, and therefore unable to use the social services, perhaps, scared of outing themselves to law enforcement, therefore unwilling or not willing to call the police or the fire department if they have an emergency. So there's a real civic problem if 25% of the members of your community aren't able to fully participate in the community. It affects the dynamics of the school system, the public services. So there were civic concerns for immigration reform as well. And finally, as we all know, there was a real political concern for immigration reform. Latinos are the largest and fastest growing members of the US demographics. They represent a huge voting bloc, and as both the Democratic and the Republican parties look at the future of their parties, they think, how can we get the Latino vote? So there was a real push, a bipartisan push for immigration reform, because they thought this is an opportunity where we could get those votes in our camp. Unfortunately, that all fell apart. That didn't go anywhere in 2006. There were massive rallies throughout the US. I remember in Los Angeles, tens of thousands of people took to the streets on May 1st, 2006 to demand comprehensive immigration reform. And of course, even though we had the president's support for something, congressionally, nothing came to pass. And we have now 10 years, 11 years later, the same problems, the same debates, the same problems of 11 or 12 million people living in the shadows. So at that time, in that context of 2005, 2006, the California Jesuits were invited by the Bishop of Tucson, Gerald Kakanis, to consider a new ministry in southern Arizona. And the reason for this was he thought that he was having a hard time talking to the parishes of southern Arizona about the reality of the broken immigration and border system. And he thought by inviting the Jesuits in, we could leverage the kind of educational and the Catholic social tradition emphasis of the Jesuits and provide a leaven for the Diocese of Tucson to think more creatively and do it more directly about how to engage and encounter the crisis in the immigration system in southern Arizona. So at the time, 2006, I had just started working for the Jesuits, and the provincial asked myself and a young Jesuit named Sean Carroll, who worked at Dolores Mission Parish in LA, to travel to Arizona to figure out how could the Jesuits best be of service to the border area. What could we learn about what the needs were, and how could we use what we have in terms of the Jesuit institutional leverage, all the universities, the high schools, and the parishes, and the social ministries of the California province, how could we bring that to bear in a helpful way on the reality at the US-Mexico border? So that's the context for what we're going to see now. What came of that was the launch of the Kino Border Initiative, and I'm just going to show the video because these images and stories are a lot more persuasive than I am.
Pues me perdí 2 veces, 2 días en el desierto, y cada paso que daba pensaba en mi hijo, pensaba en él, el quererlo abrazar, el quererlo besar, el querer jugar con él, porque pues sí es algo difícil, pero el amor de un padre a un hijo, todo se puede. El amor.
Ahora qué hago si yo ando deportado, me han fusilado 20 veces al corazón, con la mente hecha a pedazos y los pies todo ampollados. Ahora qué hago si yo ando
People don't migrate unless they have to. Why do I want to go up there? To have a television? To have another car? I got my wife, my kids, my job. I mean, why would I want to move?
Many can find jobs because they have family here and because they can find safety. That's what drives people to migrate.
My name is Daniela Vargas. In 1984, I want to say my parents decided to come to the United States, and so much of their journey came to escape the poverty that they were in.
Pues mi nombre es José Guadalupe Guillén Casillas, soy originario de Michoacán y ahorita estamos aquí en Nogales, México. Yo voy con la intención, o iba con la intención de ir a buscar a mi hijo. Tengo un hijo de 7 meses en Oakland, California. Yo solamente quiero convivir con mi hijo, por eso hice este viaje.
Ahora qué hago si yo ando deportado y los niños me preguntan dónde estoy. Cuando llegue a casa, ¿cómo voy a regresar? Ahora qué hago si yo ando deportado.
People are constantly wanting to be reunited with their families. And so you're going to do whatever it takes, even if it means losing your life, to either provide for your family or to be reunited with them.
Me ha tocado ver madres de familia que han hecho 14 intentos por lograr estar en Estados Unidos. Otras que han sido violadas varias veces en diferentes fronteras por haber querido estar con sus hijos.
They are not told what's involved in getting from the border here. Many of those folks down there who are running this deal will say, oh, sure, just go over that hill there and you'll find the town. Well, over that hill is 19 miles of rough terrain.
Dime Dios que estoy pagando pa' pagarlo. Yo que debo, crimen nunca cometí. Tú me diste 4 niños, yo soy papi para ellos. Dime entonces, ¿qué quieres que yo haga aquí? Si me cruzo, por el cerro está la mafia. Si me agarran, seguro me matarán. Si me pierdo, estoy sin agua, o la migra me alcanza. Si no cruzo, soy cobarde y mal papá.
Duré 2 días, como te digo, es muy difícil porque sin saber para dónde ir, el calor, tanta ropa que te encuentras, incluso me llegué a topar con tres personas muertas.
51 people that we know of have died in the Tucson sector this year. For every body found, there are 10 that are not.
So the idea is we will build up our border security infrastructure in the populated zones to then push people out into rural areas. And in these remote mountainous terrain, they're facing death.
Obviously, the U.S. has a right to protect its border, as any nation does, but that right is not at the expense of human dignity.
That we have unnecessarily put people in a situation where they're going to die is horrible, and that they're out there thinking, oh my God, here I thought I was going to save my family with money, and I'm going to die out here.
Many people have died out here. That's a faith issue. It's a charity issue. All of it is under the control of the Sinaloa cartel, and those migrants are abused, left to die in the desert, or used as decoys for the more lucrative drug shipments.
Of the 136 people whose bodies were recovered last year, only 30 some of them had names, had identification. We have no idea who the other 100 were. So many people die anonymously in the desert.
The biggest sin is that we don't even care about their families and remains, and to me, that's the most unconscionable thing. It's what we really do to the least of us that defines us.
No hay vergüenza que yo ya no haya pasado. Yo a todo estoy dispuesto a soportar. Yo por ver a mi familia hasta la vida daría. Por el cerro voy a tener que cruzar. Por el cerro voy a tener que cruzar. Por el cerro voy a tener que cruzar.
Challenge of our migration policy and other policies is that they're driven by fear. The sense of these individuals who are coming across are coming as a threat.
Well, some people have misconceptions about migrants, sure, and one is that I think, well, they're all criminals. I mean, we have migrants who talk about this. They feel badly about crossing the border without documents into the United States, but they have no legal way to do it, and they're driven by these enormous push factors.
This perception of migrants are a threat then leads to discrimination, it leads to distancing, and then it's borne out in authorities abusing their power because they believe that they're living out the will of the American people.
Anybody that's, been in conflict, anybody that's in war, you have to dehumanize the enemy.
Llegué hasta donde la carretera del Sázabe, la milla 6, ahí salí. Se me había acabado el agua, se me había acabado la comida. Ahí donde me entregué el oficial, yo le pedí agua. El momento de estar yo tomando agua, él me pateó atrás de mi rodilla derecha.
Very violent kick that almost makes him fall down. And he said, well, why did you kick me? I didn't resist. He said, well, you need to spread your legs. He said, well, you could have just told me to spread my legs out.
2 días, 3 días, incluso hasta 7 días en el desierto. Tu cuerpo ya va muy débil y para que llegue alguien, te golpee, te agarre como muñeco. Entonces, creo que no es justo eso.
Talk to most Border Patrol agents or detention agents, and they find it very difficult to do that job if they see this as real human beings.
They become objects or statistics. I think we lose something there, like the humanity of life.
Deberían ser un poco más conscientes que no somos animales, ni no todos somos criminales. Estoy en Estados Unidos, me tratan mal. Vengo aquí a México y los mexicanos me tratan mal. Bueno, no todos. La mafia.
¿Cómo es posible que el sistema humano haga tales diferencias? Que yo pueda caminar con libertad, ir y venir, y otras personas, tantas personas que son los migrantes, están saliendo como criminales, enjuiciados, encarcelados, castigados. Esa humillación que propicia el sistema de decir, tú no vales, tú no mereces, tú eres inferior, tú eres latino, tú no eres blanco.
The only law is love your neighbor. And you tell me how putting up a wall is loving your neighbor. You tell me how deporting women and children back to a place we know they're going to get killed is loving your neighbor. I mean, it's loving yourself maybe because you want to hold on to your things. But we're making decisions based on material things, not on human beings.
When you come to the border and begin to realize that the human experience is found in a profound way. When you could put a face to that human experience instead of just saying the migrants in the box here.
Y ahorita estamos aquí en el comedor, donde apoyan mucha gente como nosotros, muchos inmigrantes que han sufrido bastantes cosas, situaciones. Y pues cuando nos reportan, aquí el grupo Beta nos traen para acá y es aquí donde recibimos ayuda como comida, alimento y algunos otros beneficios.
A lot of people in the Comedor think that because they crossed an international boundary without papers, they deserve what happened to them. And so what we try to teach people when they're in the Comedor is actually, as a human being, you have dignity. Because of that dignity, you have certain rights.
En mi trabajo aquí, mi trabajo es educación, pero básicamente es escuchar sus voces, defender sus derechos, y uno de sus derechos es expresar lo que piensan. Yo entiendo que ustedes todos vienen como de vivir algo así como una pesadilla. Para muchos en eso se convirtió el migrar, en una pesadilla. Ayudarles a que recuperen el sentido de que son personas dignas, que valen, que merecen, porque vienen sintiéndose pues muy mal por todo lo que vivieron.
That's why Kino is such a special place. There's a sense of dignity that's restored because a lot of these people have been treated like animals, have been treated like objects, have been treated like nothing.
Tratamos de que todos estos servicios los hagamos con gusto, con alegría, que ellos sientan a través de nosotros pues cariño y que somos su familia sobre todo. Gusta hacerles una dinámica todas las mañanas que se llama gimnasia cerebral. Ellos vienen muy tristes, vienen con situaciones muy difíciles y esta dinámica les ayuda a desconectarse un poquito de la situación que ellos están viviendo. Se ríen, empiezan a platicar y cambia un poquito la dinámica del comedor con este ejercicio. Ellos les invito a que pongan sus manos así, entonces empezamos la gimnasia cerebral, les digo la mano derecha, bajan sus dedos, el dedo gordo, la mano izquierda. Cuando les digo cambio, ellos tienen que hacer cambio, cambio, cambio. Y es importante porque ellos de momento sienten que no pueden y lo hacen y empiezan a reír. Luego, cuando yo diga cambio, vamos a hacer lo contrario. Cambio. Cambio, cambio, cambio y por último cambio.
I think of that general experience that I have pretty regularly just of leading migrants in prayer, which for me is one of the most powerful experiences I have at KBI because it's a powerful moment of encounter and to be there and in that space and in that place and simply by just beginning the prayer and beginning this blessing and to feel the silence descend on that space. I see their heads bowed and there's just this posture of this total openness and vulnerability.
I'll tell you, you sit through that and it's palpable, the silence. I mean, these guys who have just gone through hell, I mean, they're just, just totally separated from everything that they know is secure and safe. For those few minutes, are together, are united. It transcends all of these things that separate us.
I think of my dad's experience. And my dad never went to school. My dad went to school to learn to raise me. And he came to this country because he wanted to work. And to see me walk the stage last year was something that he never could conceive in his mind. And so that dream for my dad was come here and work. And then it evolved into, I have children now. My dream for them is to have a better life than I did.
Yo sé que en todo me acompañas, porque a veces te siento lejos. Diosito, no me dejes más. Acá termina el coro, a ver si se escucha. Fuego, fuego, yo tengo un fuego por dentro, no lo puedo apagar, no lo quiero apagar. Y termina, sueños, yo tengo un sueño por dentro, no lo puedo apagar, no lo quiero apagar.
And then that dream evolved into my children are going to have education and make an impact in this world.
No pierdo las esperanzas de algún día verlo, algún día abrazarlo, jugar con él. Yo pienso que sería lo más hermoso que me pasaría después de tanto tormento. Yo pienso que un minuto con él aliviaría todo este dolor.
I have to honor my father's dream because it was there before I was there. And now that I'm a part of that dream, how do I contribute?
The wall that's a few miles from here would not be there if there weren't walls between our ears. All of our ears. We have walls. We've built walls. We don't even know that they're there, cultural walls. And until those walls are taken down, the other ones won't fall. They will fall someday. Those walls are coming down.
Me da esperanza ver la lucha de los migrantes y ver que ellos mismos tienen una fe grande, inquebrantable, que no obstante todo lo que viven, no se doblegan. No continúan. A mí eso me da mucha esperanza.
You really can't build a wall against hope because hope is one of the few things that we as humans hold on to, but even more so for the migrants because sometimes things can seem very hopeless, but then there's kind of a sense of joy of, but I'm still alive and I'm going to try it again.
Tal vez intentaré cruzar, tal vez tenga suerte, tal vez no. Eso hay que dejárselo a Dios. Solamente eso. Dios es el que decide. Mi hijo se llama Brandon Isaac, pero lo conozco por el gordo. Está gordito.
The folks at Creighton dreamed of this project based on a student delegation that they had led to the Keynote Border Initiative. Many of your schools have delegations that go to Keynote Border Initiative. Has anyone been on one? A couple folks have. And I know some faculty and staff from Jesuit universities have gone there through the Ignatian Colleagues program. I believe that's how you went, right, Michelle? So, I'm grateful to John O'Keefe and the folks at Creighton for letting us use that today. But I want to show and center my remarks on the principles that we've put into action, if I can get out of this program. So these are shots. So if you haven't been to, or if you don't know where Nogales is, it's in the southeastern corner of Arizona, almost to New Mexico. It's the major port of deportation for southern Arizona. And Nogales, Sonora in Mexico has about 400,000 people. Nogales in Arizona is a small town of like 20,000 people. And it's a major port of deportation for the entire Southwest. People apprehended and detained anywhere in the US might be flown to Phoenix and then bussed down to be deported through Nogales. Some images of, this was in the first year that we operated, some of the migrants that we met who were being deported. Buses come at any hour of the day, and at that time, buses were even coming in the middle of the night and dropping off deportees in the middle of the night, even though we have a policy that we aren't to, the US Border Patrol had a policy not to deport people between the hours of 8 p.m. and 8 a.m. We found that they were doing it on a regular basis. Busloads of people, women, unaccompanied children, being dumped at the border as they're being deported from the US in the middle of the night. So one of the first things that we did was to raise awareness about that practice and to petition to Customs and Border Patrol to change that. We weren't, we had to hold the US government up to its own policies and say we're not living up to our own commitments about the care for the human rights and dignity of the people that we're deporting from our country. Multidimensional mission of the Keynote Border Initiative. There are three major legs that the stool of the KBI stands on, and those are humanitarian assistance, the direct outreach to deported migrants to meet their basic human needs. Second is education and conversation. The KBI seeks to be a catalyst for conversation about the border reality. And in that spirit, we engage with all sorts of folks. We visit with the Border Patrol regularly. We talk to ranchers whose lands are crossed by migrants. We talk to community members who see an uptick in violence because of the movement of people, drugs, and arms on either side of the border. And we talk to visiting delegations, and we go out and do parish presentations to talk about the border reality. And the whole spirit is let's promote dialogue, let's talk about this. When we were doing the needs assessment in 2006 and 2007, we came to this uncomfortable conclusion that the closer we got to the border, the less willing people were willing to talk about the border. The less likely they wanted to talk about the complications that the border presented. Because so many folks on either side of the border were affected by the broken system. On the US side of the border, there's been a huge increase in the number of people working for the Border Patrol and for customs enforcement. And in parishes in particular, priests did not want to talk about the border system because half of their congregation had family members that were crossing, and the other half were working for law enforcement to try and stop people crossing the border. So there was this kind of silence that descended as we got closer to the border to talk about the complicated reality. So one of the things that KBI does is they're there to be a catalyst for conversation about the border. Let's talk about the ways that the human rights are affected. Let's talk about the ways that communities on both sides of the border are affected adversely by our broken systems of immigration. We also do research and advocacy. Every migrant that comes through the KBI's doors to receive services has a basic interview about where they're from, how their human rights have been upheld or abused at any point in the process of their journey north, of their apprehension and detention, and their deportation. We use that information to inform, credibly, the advocacy that we seek to do at the border. And then the fourth leg, and this is something that really evolved as KBI has matured, is this sense that we are in collaboration with other agencies. The KBI isn't there to solve the broken immigration system. We're there to be a witness, and we're there to help and support all the other agencies that are doing incredible things along the US-Mexico border, as well as advocacy offices in Washington, D.C. that are doing great things to advocate for the change in policies. Some images from those early years. I mean, kids as young as 6 and 7 being deported, unaccompanied children being deported into a city they'd never been to, where they don't know a soul. This immigrant in the upper left-hand corner here, Jorge, I remember meeting him, and he impressed upon me. He had the tiniest photo I'd ever seen of his wife and child, who he had left behind, in order to get a job and to send them money. And he's like, this is the whole reason. I've been apprehended and deported, just like Pepe from the video, many times. And yet the reason I do it is for these people whom I love. And it just impressed upon me this sense that the economic reasons that people are migrating, the vast majority, I would say nearly 90% of the migrants that we interview who seek services from KBI are economic migrants. They're people who could not have economic opportunity in their home countries or their towns of origin, and so they head north looking for those economic opportunities. The other 10% are refugees fleeing violence, I would say. Roughly between 7 and 10% are people who are fleeing violence in their home countries. And someone referenced this yesterday, the triangle of countries in northern Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, have been sending the most migrants our way, people who are fleeing violence. Of course, the US isn't supposed to deport Central Americans through Mexico, and yet we do. We find that in the KBI, we receive roughly 10% of the migrants that we receive who've been deported from the US into Mexico are Central Americans. Part of that is expediency. The US doesn't want to trace down exactly where a migrant is from, and so when they're deporting them, they want to do it quickly. And if someone says that they're from Mexico, they're going to deport them there if they can't prove if the US government can't prove otherwise. So we deport Central Americans into Mexico on a regular basis. And of course, they have nothing in Nogales. They have no family and social network, so of course they're going to try and turn around and come back. At the Comodore, we offer meals and basic supplies. You saw clothing, medical assistance. We do intake interviews. We get to know the stories of where they're from. We also try to get a sense of how have their rights been abused, and if they have a denunciation they need to make, a human rights claim, then we will get them the resources that they need to make that. Over the last, I think, 18 months, we've assisted about 50 people in making formal complaints either to the US or the Mexican authorities about human rights abuses that they've experienced at the hands of the government. And that's not to say any of the number of ways that they've been traumatized by other factors in their journey north or when they were in the US. Economic exploitation, sexual exploitation. There are any number of ways that the migrants have experienced trauma. So by the time they're being deported into Nogales, Mexico, it's a real low point in their lives. They've been traumatized, and now they don't know what's next. They've risked their lives to get to the US, they've been deported. What's next? We meet them at that moment of crisis with a spirit of hospitality and generosity. We say, you know what, this is a safe place. We're going to let you get on your feet, we're going to feed you, and we're not going to help you cross again, but we're just going to help you, we're going to give you that sense of human dignity that you've been lacking in this process so that you can determine what your next step is for your life and for your family. We have a small shelter for unaccompanied women and children, Casa Nazaret. It only has 8 beds in it, and we serve about 400 people a year in that. And it's a wonderful place. The Missionary Sisters of the Eucharist that run that have an incredible charism of presence and hospitality, setting a real sense of welcome and safety. We had a grant from CRS that allowed us to do some gender-based trauma therapy, basically. We could talk to women about the gendered violence they'd experienced at different points in their journeys. And it gives them a sense that a safe place to stay when they've been deported to a strange city where they've never been before. We give them a sense of pride and respect that they have something to contribute. And from that safe place, they can decide what next to do in their life. We've had several children born there. Babies have been born we're in the business of deporting pregnant people all the time. We don't want migrants to give birth in the U.S. because their kids are going to become citizens in the U.S. And so we've had some kids born there as well. Education, this is just some images of the different educational outreach delegations, youth groups, and parish visits that we do to talk about immigration. And then advocacy. We've put together several reports that have contributed to congressional hearings on immigration policy. That's a picture of Sean Carroll testifying in Congress about the results of our documented failures report, as well as our values on the line was a follow-up report we did in 2015, talking about the particular human rights and policy abuses and shortcomings of U.S. policy at the border that lead to unnecessary family separation, ignoring the violence that is done to migrants. And right now, our current focus is on asylum. There are a lot of asylee seekers who don't get the proper due process that our country offers for asylum claims to be heard. So what are the 5 virtues or principles that I want to share with you and maybe inspire you to think about how can you personally, as students and faculty at Jesuit universities, how can you embody these virtues or principles, but also institutionally, how can you and your campus make a commitment to these kinds of virtues? And the first one, I'll put them all out and then we'll talk about each of them. The first one I talk about is stance. And the way that I think about this is Steve Prevet at USF once quoted this to me, and it stuck with me like 20 years later. There's a Brazilian proverb that the head thinks from where the feet are planted. In other words, where you stand determines what you see. So how can you pick up your feet and place them in a context of human suffering? It's one thing to be moved with compassion and sympathy for people who are experiencing trauma. And a lot of humanitarian support and the raising of money for issues is based on that sympathy. But it's another to pick up your feet and to stand with people who are experiencing that suffering. And there are ways that you can do that without traveling around the world. There are a lot of hot spots in the world we've heard about in Sudan and Syria, of course, northern Mexico. You don't have to go there. You know from the community partners you've met here in Worcester, there are people in your own communities, your campus communities, who experience the reality of being a migrant or a refugee. How can you get in touch with them and allow that encounter to stand with them to inform your position? I think that's really key. As we think about, and as the California province thought about how can we be a catalyst for good at the US and Mexico border, we came to the conclusion that we needed to stand, we had to come up with a ministry that stood with foot firmly planted on either side of the border. Because the broken immigration system isn't a US problem, it's not a Mexican problem, it's a problem that we share and that communities on both sides of the border are experiencing. And if we wanted to be an authentic, credible witness to that, we needed to come up with a ministry that stood with a foot on each side of the border. We have a binational board of directors, we have a binational staff, and so standing in that place is very important to us. It keeps us honest and it keeps us grounded in what is real. Humility. Humility is the virtue that is basically saying, I can't fix this problem by myself. And the way that we came to that, when Sean and I were doing the needs assessment, of course, 2 white North Americans coming down to the border, as we visited all the towns along the US-Mexico border, we were told, don't build a shelter. Don't come down here and think that you're going to fix our problems. And it was really important for us to hear that. And as we got to know the Missionary Sisters of the Eucharist and the Jesuits in the Mexican province, they really impressed upon us and invited us into a posture of humility. They told us the migrants, the communities at the border are the best people who can tell you what their needs are. Don't think that you, coming from, Loyola Marymount University or Santa Clara or USF, don't think that you know what's right and best for our communities. If you're going to come here to help us, listen to us. And Ingracia, in that video, gave a wonderful testament to that when she said, we're here to give you some food, but we're also here to hear your voice. Your voices, the voices of the migrants, are the ones who are going to keep us honest and keep us focused on what the needs really are here. So cultivating a posture of humility is important to our advocacy work and to our humanitarian outreach. We have much more to learn from the people we're engaging with than we have to fix their problems or to somehow to save them from whatever situation they're in. The next virtue or principle I'd like to invite you to is this idea of mutual transformation. And it's intimately tied to the idea of humility. And this is really solidarity or accompaniment at its best. I think the folks who've worked with JRS, where JRS has really integrated this virtue into their mission, they realize that 9 times out of 10, you get much more out of, the volunteer gets much more out of the experience than the person that you're helping. Peter Morin, one of the founders of the Catholic worker community, used to say this: I can give you bread, I can give you meat, I can give you coffee, but you're an ambassador of God, talking about the homeless people he served with. He's like, you transform my life much more than I transform yours. John Sobrino in El Salvador likes to describe the world in 2 ways. He's like, the world is split between 2 kinds of people. There are those who live in the abundance of life, and there are those who live very close to death. 2/3 of the world lives very close to death. Certainly these deported migrants are living close to death. We in this room, most of us probably, live in the abundance of life. We are better people when we are engaged with people who are living close to death. They remind us what's important. They give us a sense of what faith really is, what hope is, what the values of family, the meaning of joy can really be. When you have nothing and you're able to encounter joy, you encounter humanity, you encounter faith among people who have very little, who've suffered a great deal. So this idea that, and John Sobrino says this, there's no salvation outside of the poor. I think we experience that. The staff at the KBI, visitors who've been to the KBI realize that I'm a better person, I'm a better Christian, I'm a better parent, I'm a better spouse, because I'm in relationship with people who are living in a very precarious situation. And they remind me about what my fundamental values are and what they ought to be. And they challenge us to live according to those values. So that idea of mutual transformation, we're there to help each other. We're there to better approximate the kingdom of God. Greg Boyle, our colleague in Southern California who works at Homeboy Industries, likes to say that, we transform each other's experience. We teach each other what it means to live in a community that better resembles the community and the kingdom of God that God intended. Collaboration has been an aspect of the Kino Border Initiative that is the backbone of the entire organization. 6 different Catholic organizations came together and pooled their resources to provide staff and funding for the initial launch of the project. And those 6 organizations are committed to working together, but also there's a vast network of other organizations that work along the border. We're not there to transpose or duplicate their efforts. We're there to work in conjuntos with them. We share the responsibility. We're not there to displace any other organizations that are already doing good things. As a matter of fact, our network is much stronger because others are engaged in this work. And so this idea of collaboration is part of the DNA of the Kino Border Initiative. The virtue that I just want to talk about is this idea of patience or persistence. And especially for young adults who are interested in helping the world become a better place, we want to see results. There are human rights tragedies going on in the world, and we want to change them. A lot of people in this room have been working on these issues for decades, and we will probably still be working on these issues for many more decades. That's not to discourage us, it's to kind of like, how do we then stay motivated? How do we tap into a sense of urgency? At the KBI, we're very fortunate. We have the daily urgency of people being deported. We have to meet their needs. So getting them food, getting them the clothes that they need, tending to their medical needs is a daily urgency. And also that the relationships that we form then give us the sense of long-term urgency. How can we, because we're now going to be faithful to these relationships of mutual love and transformation, how can we start changing the paradigm so that we don't perpetuate the kind of suffering that those folks are experiencing? Martin Luther King has a wonderful image that he borrowed from the Massachusetts abolitionist Theodore Parker, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. This idea at the KBI is that the moral arc of the universe isn't bending towards justice just on its own. It's just not a natural phenomenon. It's because people like you and me, the migrants that we encounter at the KBI, we jump up and we grab onto that arc and we bend it towards justice by being faithful to one another. And I think that that's the challenge, I think, for young adults today. How can you get engaged with people in need who have that sense of immediate urgency that's going to inspire you to stay clinging to that arc of the moral universe for the next 10 or 15 years? We've heard throughout different presentations in this conference so far, this is a grim time for people who are concerned about refugees and migrants in our world. Staying faithful to the relationships that you can form in your own communities, the refugees in your campus communities, the migrants in your campus communities. I want to say every college, every Jesuit college and university has undocumented students who are attending them. They don't hold up a neon sign and say, I'm undocumented, because there's still a lot of shame that's related to being undocumented in our country. But I can guarantee you, if you ask around at your campus, talk to the Jesuit community, talk to people, you'll find that there are people on your campus who are living in the daily reality of uncertainty because of their documentation status, either themselves or their family members. Get to know them. Find out what the challenges are. And because of that relationship, you'll become much more invested in the long-term transformation of the structures that are keeping people in situations of trauma and suffering. I'm going to stop it there. I could go on for a lot more, but I wanted to give some opportunity for Q&A and to give our other practitioners an opportunity to share their wisdom. Sure.
Hi, I'm Mary McInerney from University of San Francisco.
Hi, Mary.
Hi. Do you follow up on the folks at the Kino border? Like, what happens? Do they go back home? Do they keep trying? What's the majority?
I would say the majority of people try to cross again. Now, the KBI isn't explicitly there to help them cross again. We're simply there to humanize them as they're, as they recover from the deportation process. It's really up to them what they're going to do with their lives. If they, it's up to their discernment. Unfortunately, we do get a lot of follow-up because when people try to return, they get apprehended and deported all over again. So I was talking to Sean Carroll a few months ago, and he was saying that there's a guy they must have seen 8 or 9 times who's been deported and he's come through. So they get updates on people that way. But most of the times, we're involved in their lives for about 2 weeks. Unless they stay longer, like an unaccompanied woman or child might stay a little bit longer at our shelter. But typically, they're just in Nogales long enough to get on their feet and to figure out what to do if they're going to return home or cross again.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, my name's Jeff Warden. I'm from Holy Cross.
Hi.
I was just wondering if you could elaborate on what agencies you collaborate with and how you build those relationships and how you continue to keep those relationships with those agencies.
That's a great question. If you go to the KBI website, KinoBorderInitiative.org, they list them formally. I remember in the early years, we did a lot of there are 6 collaborating agencies that we founded the KBI with. The 2 dioceses on either side of the border, Diocese of Tucson and the Archdiocese of Hermosillo, Mexico. And then also Jesuit Refugee Service USA, the Missionary Sisters of the Eucharist, the small group of nuns that run our humanitarian outreach programs, and both the Jesuit provinces in Mexico and California. So that collaboration took, a year and a half of saying, how can we, as 6 Catholic organizations, pool our resources and bring them to bear at the border? And as we did that, we realized that, and a lot of that came in the first 2 years, when Sean and I were traveling across the border, talking to the different humanitarian organizations like No More Deaths. Border Links has been a long-term Tucson-based immersion and education program. There are defenders of human rights and children's rights on the Mexico side of the border. You just kind of interview people. Where do they get the resources to deal with issues? other folks who've been to the border area know that there's a network of faith-based and secular organizations that are concerned about the well-being of people. So when you get there, you just kind of, you say, how can we be helpful? And you figure out, where can we not duplicate one another's efforts, but where can we match our and leverage our resources? We have a list of, we recently signed it on with 18 other border organizations on a letter. It's on the website this month. So there's at least 18 organizations in Southern Arizona that we are advocating with to change the asylum seeking process in the U.S. and to get the U.S. to live up to the commitments that we have with an asylee process. So it's about relationships, basically. It's about going out there and demonstrating to one another that you're there for the long term, that you're not just going to come in and try and make a quick fix, that you want to be part of the community, and that you want to be part of the solution to the community's problems.
Hi, I'm Jenny Ryan from Holy Cross. Just to follow up on Jeff's question, have you had any, or has the Keno Border Initiative had any success or possible routes to collaboration with Border Patrol, with institutional or governmental organizations?
Yeah, I would say that the Keno Border Initiative has a good relationship with Border Patrol in the Tucson sector, in that Sean and Joanna, two of the staff on the U.S. side of the border, are able to meet with them pretty regularly. Delegations who've been down there typically will go and meet with representatives from the Border Patrol. There's a mutual awareness and a mutual respect for the risk that Border Patrol members are taking when they're on patrol. They encounter a lot of things. It's not just migrants who are crossing the border. There are drugs and arms moving across the border, and there are gangs that are protecting those folks. So it's not without risk that folks are, there to patrol the line. And I think that the Keno Border Initiative has a healthy respect for the kinds of things that the people who are put in that position have to do. However, we also have open channels of dialogue to talk about, well, here's what we're hearing from migrants about how they're treated when they're apprehended. Here are ways that migrants' rights have not been upheld or supported. And having documented lists of the numbers of people who report that they've been manhandled or physically abused at the hands of our Border Patrol. It's tough giving that kind of news to people, but you have to have a relationship in order for it to make any credibility with them.
One last question.
Sure.
Thank you. I'm Vicki Langer from Holy Cross.
Hi.
I wanted to hear a little bit more specifics about the advocacy part of your work. I mean, you gave one specific example of pushing for not having folks deported between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m.
Yeah.
And then you talked about the asylee part, which I assume, correct me if I'm wrong, only applies to the 10% who would be fleeing from violence, not the economic migrants.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I was curious, aside from kind of specific human rights abuses that are in contravention of our own laws or asylee policy, does the Keno Border Initiative either itself advocate for or just support a particular immigration overhaul type of policy? I mean, is there some specific policy that you guys either informally or formally
We've certainly
support?
been instrumental and helpful and signed on to the efforts of the U.S. Catholic bishops to put out the principles for fair, comprehensive immigration reform. We don't have a particular policy that we point to and say this would be the ideal situation that would solve the problem. What we're basically, in our mission statement, we're trying to advocate for humane and just immigration reform. And that's a broad umbrella, but it gives us the flexibility to be responsive to the needs that arise at the border that we need to shine a light on, like the deportations after dark, for example. There are a number of initiatives that they've helped gather information and data on. One of them was family separation and the U.S. detention policy of separating parents from their children when they're apprehended together. So they collect a lot of that data and they help other organizations that are preparing those summaries for congressional review or policy review. And then Sean and JRS collaborated with KBI to produce 2 formal reports about ways that we're failing in the U.S. to live up. So in addition to the asylee I just have to point you to those reports, which are available on the KBI website, where they list out specific things that they've gathered information and data on.
Thank you.
Yeah, and they also invite researchers from universities to come and do research there. So we have accommodations available. We have an apartment on either side of the line where a researcher could spend a few weeks to do on-the-ground data gathering and research for policies and initiatives that would be helpful to changing policy. Does that make sense? Yeah. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Mark. That was an excellent presentation overview of KBI. Really, having been there myself, I really feel like you conveyed the heart and the soul and just what a special place it is to be. So thank you for sharing that. So now we're going to shift to hearing from our expert panelists, and they'll each have about 10 to 15 minutes. We've asked them to respond to the ideas brought up during Mark's remarks. And we've also asked them to include a brief overview of their organization and how it and the specific work that they do within it connects to the session theme of principles in practice. Then after they've each spoken, we'll have time for Q&A with all of them. So before they speak individually, let me introduce them to you. Let's see, in the middle we have, and I'm just introducing alphabetically, in the middle we have Julia McPherson, who's the Director of Advocacy and Operations at Jesuit Refugee Service USA. She develops and promotes policy positions related to refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced persons. Leads a community engagement program to educate and mobilize advocates, and oversees JRS's institutional operations. Prior to joining JRS in 2014, Julia was a member of CARE USA's policy and advocacy team for 11 years. She has extensive experience in policy analysis, government relations, and communications in the international humanitarian and development sectors. Julia has a bachelor's degree in political science from Villanova University. Some of you out there know that's also my alma mater, so excited to have a fellow Wildcat here. And a master's in international development studies from George Washington University. She serves as chair of the board of directors for Educate to Envision International, an NGO working to empower young people in Honduras, and is an appointed commissioner on the Montgomery County, Maryland Commission for Women. And then furthest to my left is Nick Napolitano, and he is the Assistant for Social Ministries for the Jesuits on the East Coast of the U.S., which is essentially the same job that Mark Potter had on the West Coast of the U.S. In that capacity, Nick encourages and supports Jesuits, Jesuit schools, and parishes to engage in the most pressing faith justice issues of our time, including welcoming migrants and refugees. Nick earned his BA in Urban Studies and MA in International Politics and Economic Development from Fordham University, where he also worked for 6 years in the Dorothy Day Center for Service and Justice. Nick serves on the board of directors of the Ignatian Solidarity Network, Cristo Rey High School in New York, and on the advisory board of the Center for Faith and Public Life. Nick lives in the Bronx with his wife, Michelle, and daughters, Grace and Hannah. And then Norbert Pichet is the country director for JRS Canada. As country director for Canada, he represents JRS to the Canadian bishops and national organizations for the defense of refugees. Norbert has extensive experience in the refugee immigration field. He has worked for 15 years at the Centre Francophone de Toronto as a settlement counselor and later as the coordinator of settlement services. Previous to that, he was a Jesuit volunteer at Romero House, a welcome center for refugee claimants in Toronto. He has a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Education from the University of Manitoba. So let's start with, again, alphabetically, we'll start with Julia.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for sticking around for Thursday morning. Really appreciate it. What I wanted to do with a few slides, here we go, was to present a bit of a snapshot of JRS, who we are and what we do. Mark mentioned a bit of our work with KBI in terms of helping found KBI. Father Hollenbach yesterday mentioned a bit about our work, our mission, some of his experiences with JRS through his career as well, and we may have chatted over the past couple of days. So for those of you who have been supportive of JRS, thank you. For those of you who have never heard of JRS, I hope this presents an opportunity to learn a bit more about us, and hopefully we can continue or begin a collaboration in the future. So I wanted to start with just the origins of JRS in terms of who we are and how we were founded. So back in 1980, Father Pedro Arrupe was at that point the Superior General of the Jesuits, and many of you are familiar with Father Arrupe and his teachings and his vision and mission. And at that time, globally, the Vietnamese boat people crisis was one of the most pressing crises of the time, where thousands of Vietnamese were fleeing, and this picture depicts in precarious circumstances, fleeing for their lives and fleeing for safety and security. So Father Arrupe put a call out to his fellow Jesuits. He was witnessing this, like many people around the world were witnessing this, and felt that as Jesuits, really something needed to happen. They needed to do something. Being called to work on the margins, to work with the most vulnerable. At that point in time, these individuals, these families were the most vulnerable. So he put this call out to his fellow Jesuits, and what ensued was the creation of JRS. So today we are an international non-governmental organization. We operate in 47 countries. So the map shows you, of those 47 countries, we have 10 regional offices. Our office in Washington, D.C., where I'm based, is our North America regional office. And so you'll see where the other offices are located as well. Our international office is based in Rome at the Vatican, so we work very closely with our staff in Rome as well. Annually, we serve about 750,000 refugees. So the organization itself is devoted specifically to refugees and other forcibly displaced persons. So our mission is very focused, very specific. Again, thinking back to the origins of the organization and wanting to work with the most vulnerable. And as you've heard over the past couple of days, with the global refugee crisis today, 65.6 million displaced persons and the number rising every year, really refugees and displaced people are the most vulnerable. And you can really make the case for that. So our mission is very specific, very focused. Now, our mission, technically, and Father Hollenbach also mentioned this yesterday, is to accompany, to serve, and to advocate on behalf of refugees and other forcibly displaced persons. And the way that takes form is in a variety of various programs that we run throughout the world. So in those 47 different countries, our programming really varies depending on the particular context. No situation is the same, so we really tailor our programming based on the needs of the local refugee population. So we work both in protracted crisis situations. The photograph is actually a photo that I took from this past January. I made a visit to Chad, which is a country in sort of north central Africa, right underneath Libya. And they are, Chad is home to about 300,000 Darfuri refugees from Sudan on the eastern part of the country. And the eastern part of Chad, and they have been refugees in Chad for over a decade. So this is what we call a protracted crisis situation, where these are refugees, and there are a number of situations, protracted crisis refugee situations in Africa in particular, where there are no durable solutions in the near future for the refugees in this population. So in Chad, for example, the Darfuri refugees are living in 12 camps along the eastern border with Sudan. There are about 300,000 of them. Currently, JRS is running all of the education programs in the camp. So it's a very sort of formal education program. And we do other things like child-friendly spaces, et cetera. But that's one sort of scenario. In other places, for example, in a more recent, relatively recent crisis in Syria, we operate both within Syria and also in the neighboring countries, in Jordan and Lebanon specifically. And in Syria, our work is focused more on emergency assistance. So that's a bit different than what we may be doing in other countries. And then throughout Europe, for example, we do a number of different things, including legal representation for individuals who arrive and are seeking asylum, or connecting displaced persons with social services. Again, it varies depending on the context. But basically, we, in any of those scenarios, may be doing home visits with displaced persons and refugees as part of the accompaniment that is part of our mission, really walking with refugees and listening to their stories, giving them some, a context and opportunity to share their story and to talk about their journey and their hopes and how we can assist them in achieving some of their goals. In some scenarios, and oftentimes we are incorporating this more and more into our programming, in particular into our education programming, we offer counseling. And again, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, refugees in particular, have oftentimes faced a significant amount of trauma. And again, if you're thinking about an education or school setting and you're working with young children, that trauma is evident and it needs to be addressed. And so we offer psychosocial programming and counseling in many of our programs. We also place a special focus on care for people with disabilities. So again, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, so those who really need some additional assistance. We try to place a special emphasis on seeking out those with disabilities and providing extra support that they might need. I mentioned legal representation in some circumstances. Emergency assistance, really today only in Syria. That's really the only country where we are offering emergency assistance, and that takes the form of food kitchens, clothing during the winter, food baskets delivered to people's homes, that sort of thing. And then education. Education is really at the heart of the work that we do. And so I wanted to share a little bit of information about why education is so critical to our work, why we have chosen it as a focal point of our work. So globally, of the 6 million primary and secondary school-age refugees, so these are refugees who are actually part of UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency's mandate, 3.7 million of them are not in school, so more than half of them are not in school. Globally, refugee children are 5 times more likely to be out of school than non-refugee children. And then breaking it down even further, only 50% have access to primary school, and then it continues to drop. About 22% have access to secondary school, and only 1% to higher ed or tertiary education. Now, rooted in the Jesuit commitment to education, which you're all familiar with, have firsthand experience with, we seek to offer quality educational programs for refugees, again, both in refugee camp settings and in non-camp settings. So in some of those protracted crisis situations where many refugees are living in camps, or in urban settings like in Syria or in the neighboring countries. And we offer the full range of formal education from pre-primary through tertiary, so including pre-primary, primary, and secondary as well. But in addition to more formal education programs, again, we need to contextualize the work that we do. So we oftentimes offer language instruction, acknowledging that if refugees are crossing borders, oftentimes they don't speak the language of their host country, so we need to incorporate that type of programming into our work. We offer after-school tutoring, or what we might call catch-up programming. So in places like Lebanon, for example, where there's a big push to incorporate refugees into the public Lebanese school system, we'll offer some educational programming before they actually are able to start in the public school system to make sure that they're caught up. On average, refugee children are out of school for about 2 to 3 years. So there's oftentimes a gap in learning that we need to try to bridge. So we'll do some tutoring prep before they enroll, and then once they're enrolled, we'll also offer after-school tutoring and many times extracurricular activities. That is part of just trying to bring some sense of normalcy back to a child's life, an adolescent's life. So offering soccer or plays, after-school plays, anything that might help them try to again get back to normal or as normal as possible. And then trauma healing, the counseling that I mentioned earlier, more and more is something that we're incorporating throughout all of our programming. In an effort to really boost better recognition of our education work and to also grow our work in education and to be able to serve more refugees through our programming, a couple of years ago in late 2015, we actually launched a 5-year campaign called the Global Education Initiative, which aims to increase the number of beneficiaries who have access to our education program. So it's primarily a fundraising campaign, and we here at JRS USA are fully vested in it. The goal is to raise $35 million. We've reached about 40% of that goal. And we're working very closely with our Rome office to achieve this goal again so that we can help fund many of these programs and serve more people and try to bridge some of that gap in terms of the number of refugee children who don't have access. Now, finally, I just wanted to talk, in addition to the programmatic work, so functionally, our office in Washington really helps support our overseas work. We don't do any direct service with refugees here in the United States. So in addition to fundraising and helping to support the work that JRS is doing around the globe, we also, here in the U.S., engage in a variety of advocacy and outreach activities to try to spread the word about what we're doing, engage with partners, and collaborate as much as possible. So these are just a couple of pictures of some of the activities that we've been able to organize. Most recently, the first photo is of Father Tom Smolich, who is our international director in Rome, and he was able to speak at the World Humanitarian Summit about a year ago about JRS's approach to our work on education. So that was a great opportunity for us to be able to share our work and collaborate with some other folks in the field. The center picture, you might recognize a few faces. We have Norbert in the photo as well. We've hosted most recently a few advocacy days in Washington, D.C., bringing together some of our partners, our board members, members of local Jesuit institutions in D.C. in particular. We're hoping to expand that in the coming months and years, to be able to go directly to members of Congress on Capitol Hill to deliver some messaging about how the U.S. government can improve policies directed towards refugees. And then the final photo is a recent report that we released just last month, and it's based on the trip that I mentioned that I took to Chad to try to document some of these challenges that we're seeing firsthand. So some of the work that our staff are doing day in and day out, trying to make sure that not only is the work that they're doing on the ground critical and important in service to the refugees that we're working with, but to try to collect that information and create a narrative that we can then share with other decision makers and policymakers and advocates to try to create some larger change. So in this case, it's talking about some of the challenges and opportunities of delivering education programming in a protracted crisis setting. So in this case, for refugees who will more than likely not be able to go back home, very few of them will be resettled to a third country like the U.S., but really looking at ways to integrate them more fully into the Chadian host community to make sure that they have as many opportunities as possible. So that's one of the ways that we're trying to disseminate some of that information is through the development of these kinds of resources. And then finally, just a couple of other pictures that actually speak to some of our outreach activities. If you were here the first day, you may have heard about our refugee simulation, Walk a Mile in Our Shoes, that we developed recently, and we've had a great response in terms of the number of Jesuit institutions that have supported this event. So the first photo is from a university that had held an event recently. The center one is actually from the University of Scranton, who's really taken on this issue of the refugee crisis. Some of you may have gone to the session they hosted yesterday. This is from an event that they hosted last fall that we participated in. So just trying to really serve as a resource to Jesuit institutions who are interested in learning more about refugee issues or taking action and mobilizing. We really want to serve as that resource, either as an expert in the field, as a conduit to our colleagues overseas, or as a partner in trying to draw all of these various resources from the Jesuit network towards this cause. And then the final photo is actually from 2 high schools in the DC area, Gonzaga and Georgetown Prep, that helped support an event we organized on Capitol Hill focused on education as well. So they came out to support that cause. So I will wrap up there, but happy to answer any questions during the Q&A. Thanks.
Okay, good morning, everyone. And just wanted to express my appreciation and gratitude for all of the work that Michelle and Isabel and Dennis and the JUHAN Fellows put into this gathering. I think they all deserve a round of applause. It's been wonderful to be here, and it's a real privilege to follow Dr. Potter and his intimate knowledge of the Kino Border Initiative. Really a great opportunity for us to hear about how this entity responded and how these ideas went from initial outreach and research visit to the incredible work that is happening on the border with so many wonderful partners today. I'll talk a little bit about the work of the Jesuit provinces and my role as assistant of social ministries to support faith justice engagement across more than 50 Jesuit institutions and communities on the East Coast, from Portland, Maine, down to Atlanta, Georgia. But I really want to talk a little bit about some of my thoughts or ideas from that work of ways that you all can carry this conference and time together back to your home communities. I think that's a question that a lot of you will be asking later on today, and I figure why not take this time to start planting those seeds and to stick my nose in what you might do in the future. Also, that's a very big part of my work, again, is to accompany and support faculty, students, staff, parishioners at our institutions. I'll focus some of my thoughts about how the principles of how the Jesuits do that, how we put this in practice, and then again go into some of those suggestions or ideas of ways you might bring this home. How the Jesuits promote justice in the world today, I really break into 5 components. Jesuits and lay colleagues accompany, they serve, they research, they raise awareness, and they transform unjust structures, primarily through advocacy efforts. I think it's useful to name that way of promoting justice, or those ways of promoting justice, because it really echoes some of the comments we've heard over the last day and a half from Father Hollenbach yesterday in talking about JRS's mission. It is not surprising to me that the way that we promote justice, 3 of those ways are definitive elements of how JRS works around the world: accompany, serve, advocacy, right? But it also, I think, rings true to the great work of Kino and what Mark shared with us. And I think it's a call for each of us to think about in terms of how accompaniment can help inspire us to carry this work beyond some of these really challenging conversations that we've had, challenging times politically, and decisions being made in Washington. How can we live up to our values and create the world that we're called to as students and staff members at Jesuit institutions? I also want to just note, I think we've been talking about refugees broadly, and when you think of that, you immediately go to Africa and to the Middle East. But there is a refugee crisis right here in our own continent. And part of the work that we do, and I'm grateful for Mark for naming, there's a ton of economic migrants that are causing people to flee their countries, their homes in South and Central America and the Caribbean and come to the U.S. But there are refugee and asylum seekers that are part of that group. And if you think about the 2 million plus people that were deported over the 8 years of the Obama administration and how that happened, and think about the percentage just of what KBI is working with in terms of the people they're receiving in deportees, there's a significant number of asylum-seeking people that aren't getting a chance to put that claim forward here in the U.S. So we have a lot of thinking to do in terms of our relationship with neighbors and the violence that people are facing, particularly in the Northern Triangle of Central America, in the countries of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. we include those refugees when we think about our work with immigrants and refugees at the province level and across the Jesuit Conference of Canada and the US. I think most of our work on this issue of responding to refugees is under the categories of research, raising awareness, and advocacy. Part of our hope is to create spaces for dialogue among people who have very different opinions on this issue. I'm grateful for Chris Kerr and ISN's work that he mentioned yesterday that'll be coming over the next 2 years through the Campaign for Hospitality to create tools and spaces for these conversations to happen, both within our intimate personal relationships of friends and family, but also in our school and broader city educational communities. I think there's a real challenge for us to find ways and places to speak with people who have different opinions on this issue, and I hope that's a call that y'all will bring home. We've also, as Chris talked about yesterday, been working to find ways to support students who are affected by this. Now, one of the questions that somebody posed yesterday was about specific scholarships for refugee students, and I don't have a lot to add towards what was shared, but I have encountered a number of campuses that have international students, and some of them are refugees. I think of Wheeling Jesuit out in West Virginia. I think of Lemoyne up in Syracuse. Those are places and spaces that have large number of African international students, some of whom are refugees. So I think part of our question or challenge as we go back home is to think about how to create spaces of welcome and support for those students that are already in our communities. And of course that would include undocumented students that are threatened or feel threatened by so many of the posturings and attitude that's coming out of Washington today. I have to start with the principle of accompaniment, and we've talked so much about this over the last couple of days, and I'm going to talk about it more because it's so essential to the Jesuit promotion of justice and our identity, how we approach this work. There's lots of calls, both from Pope Francis in calling on the church to be a church of and for the poor, as well as from the Jesuits to reach out to people who are marginalized and to be with those people in meaningful places and spaces. This is an integral part of our Jesuit higher educational institutional identity, and by virtue of that, it's part of your identity as a student and staff person. I think accompaniment is, as Mark really well described, about stance. It's about where you are and who you live with and how those relationships affect your outlook on the world. For the Jesuits, accompaniment is about being friends with people who are living in poverty and who are marginalized. It's about living alongside them when and wherever possible. For the Jesuits, it's both a source of spiritual nourishment in hope, in recognizing the gifts that people bring regardless of their economic or living conditions, that those relationships feed our call to both respond but also to form a relationship with God. It's also a source of credibility for us. So the Jesuits do a lot of advocacy on a number of different issues beyond immigration and refugees, but including that. But our best advocacy comes when it's fed by individuals, lay colleagues, Jesuits, who are responding and accompanying to people who are facing significant crises and needs. KBI is a perfect example of that. They didn't just want to respond through service and through conversations and education. They wanted to use those relationships, those friendships with migrants deported or making the journey north to inform decision makers in the Catholic Church, in elected office, in positions of power in the U.S. So I think accompaniment is about an opportunity to know and to be credible on the issues that we speak of. I think of some of the parishes, but it's not just parishes as I learn and visit institutions, but parishes come up in my mind that are doing incredible work in trying to accompany refugees. One of our parishes in Washington, D.C., right next to Georgetown University, Holy Trinity, worked very hard with a local refugee resettlement agency to sponsor a family that was affected initially by the travel ban before it was put on hold through a local and then appellate court judge. And they've been able to get in and to sponsor and support this refugee family from Syria. That's one family. It's not earth-changing for the refugee crisis around the world, but it is earth-changing for the Holy Trinity community, where 30 and 40 parish families are now involved and interested in the life of this family of 4 Syrian refugees. I think about our parish in Baltimore, St. Ignatius, which is in the center of the city, a little bit more central than Loyola University, Maryland, but certainly not far from the university in Baltimore. And a dinner that they have sponsored with parishioners and a local refugee service organization, creating a space to break bread, to share a meal, to share culture, to share stories with some of the refugee families that have been resettled in Baltimore. These experiences of accompaniment open us up and offer us incredible opportunities to respond to need. It comes from those relationships. So when I think about the work that the Jesuits are doing in responding to refugee issues through the province and through the Jesuit Conference in Washington, D.C., I think about those accompaniment relationships. Our advocacy is nurtured and fed by a regional inputs from Jesuits working in Mexico, in Central America, in the Caribbean, in South America. We talk with Jesuits and other colleagues that are offering and running other houses of hospitality, including what has become really a sister house to KBI on the Mexico-Guatemala border, where the Jesuits are heavily involved. We're using those experiences of Jesuits and lay colleagues to inform our advocacy in Washington, and recognizing how when the U.S. pushes out its need to secure its border further south into Mexico and Guatemala, there are additional issues that arise from that prevent people from seeking refuge and asylum who have valid claims and cases. They're just never heard because they never reach the U.S. and don't have the opportunity to apply for refugee status in country. I think about experiences we try to offer men in formation to become Jesuits, to encounter migrants and refugees. There's a migration experience that's happened every other year in the summer for young men studying to be Jesuits, where they accompany a Jesuit who's done research with migrant support and service centers along the migrant journey from Guatemala through Mexico to the U.S. border. And that's been an incredible opportunity for our men to understand and talk to migrants, but they also walk and travel much of the road that migrants make, right? And stay in these houses and hear stories. This informs who they are as priests, and again, their stance, who they care about and how they want to respond to needs and concerns in the world. I think about a recently ordained Jesuit of the Northeast province, Dan Carew, who did much of his regency in Beirut, Lebanon. He was studying Arabic there, and he responded to the needs of the Jesuits in Lebanon. As we heard yesterday, the number of Syrian refugees who have been resettled in Lebanon is astonishing. 1 in 3 people in Lebanon are Syrian refugees that have fled the country and are living there. Dan worked with JRS and Syrian refugees, and that's become a huge part of his identity as a priest. It informs all of the work that he does. So these are the kinds of opportunities, I think, that accompaniment and conversation with people affected by humanitarian crises around the world has formed and informed the Jesuits. I'm not going to talk more about the research. I think Mark did a great job, but part of what we try to encourage is to think on ways that we can use the skills and strengths of our higher education institutions, all of the faculty, the students. Hearing some of the student presentations in the breakout session, it's astonishing for me to think about the power you have to do research that's meaningful, that tells a story but addresses also an issue, a concern in the world. Our work in higher education is not just to educate y'all to get great jobs and to go on and be successful in the world. Certainly I think that's part of it. But the other part is that we are using the power and the skills and the privilege that we have in this education to do good and to help create new ways of thinking about the most serious problems in our world today. So research is at the heart of how we respond to the refugee crisis in the province. And then lastly, I'll just say that advocacy is a huge part, and something that I think each of you can think about in taking home. Mark talked a little bit about the treatment of migrants as they're deported, and families being separated, nighttime deportations. These are big issues that the Jesuit Conference and the provinces also encourage advocacy on. But we also think about the places where migrants are held before they're deported. And so there are privately run detention centers, and Mark could have spoke more about this, that we are engaging with a company as shareholders, owning a small percentage of that company through shares, and trying to internally get the company to think more about human rights policies and how people are treated in the private prison centers that they're operating. So that's part of the advocacy that we do, but we also do a lot of legislative advocacy. There was a recent conference in Miami about 2 weeks ago on prosperity and security in Central America, and that was a moment of mobilization for all of the Jesuit networks across the region, including our friends and partners in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. We were concerned that this conference focused on economic prosperity, and it was only informed by the private sector and the lens of security and the hope for further border militarization. That is too narrow a focus, and it doesn't include enough of the human rights concerns and the civil society voices that we think need to be at the table in order for long-lasting and sustainable development solutions to be made. We have to think about healthcare and education and local economic development and ways to prevent violence in communities across Central America and the Caribbean. And that wasn't part of the conversation. So we raised our voice and we expressed our concerns and joined others in writing letters to the head of DHS and members of the President's administration. Just a few minutes I wanted to offer in thinking about what you can do as you go back. So there's lots of advocacy that could happen, but that's hard to sustain. I would encourage folks, though, to add to their regular social media feeds the Jesuit Conference Facebook page and their Twitter feed, which is @JesuitJustice. It's a great way for you to know what we're thinking about and trying to respond to in the world today. I would also encourage folks to sign up for Jesuit Advocates, which is a joint advocacy platform will soon be run by ISN, JRS USA, and the Jesuit Conference. These are ways that you could very easily stay abreast of some of the policy concerns that we have related to immigration and refugees. I think each group should be going home and thinking about ways that you might be part of this campaign for hospitality. How might your campus community think on this? There's going to be a lot of materials that will come out, but it's a good conversation to have, and one I think worthwhile. I think I want to really model and mirror what folks have done here at the JUHAN conference in our hosts at Holy Cross in connecting us with some of the refugee organizations here in Worcester. That's been an amazing learning experience for me. I won't be at the visits, but in talking with some of the providers and seeing the welcome that nonprofits are doing in Worcester, I think it's really imperative for us all to connect with organizations and refugees in our home communities. That's a space for accompaniment, a space for service, a space to use those relationships to educate others about the realities of refugees living in your home community. Kim mentioned the CRS Ambassador Program, and I won't go through the list, but there are 8 Jesuit universities on the East Coast that have CRS ambassadors programs present, and that's a way to continue to have conversation with other students and faculty on campus about these issues. And then, I think it's also important to use the resources of JUHAN, right? Some of your campuses have courses that you can take online through learning programs. Some of you have JUHAN minors at your schools. Continue to think about this as a vocation. Is this something you feel called to do? Can you pursue international volunteer opportunities or think about fellowships or grad programs that might continue to expose you to this field? I think those are good questions to continue to, as we heard in the career panel on humanitarianism, careers to think about how this works for you. So I'll end there and just, again, offer my gratitude for the chance to be here and myself as a resource to any of the groups on the East Coast that might want to explore this issue further. You can find my contact information on the Jesuit Conference website or on the Jesuits East website. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank the organizing team, first of all, to have me here. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I don't know if you noticed in the photograph that Julia showed, I was wearing the same shirt. For the record, it's not the only shirt that I have, but I do love this shirt.
You did it for Holy Cross Purple.
That's right, exactly. Throughout my talk, I'd like you to listen for what Mark was talking about in terms of those 5 virtues. So please listen attentively. You might pick out a few. When we talk about welcoming the stranger as a faith-based organization, what do we mean? Is there anything different from any other organization? Let's look at that. We help them learn the language. Well, we help them find housing. We help them with healthcare, etc. This first step is what I call fulfilling the basic needs in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I think most of us, whether we are from a faith-based organization or not, do this well. Although this step is important, we all need to have our physiological and security needs met. It is but the frame of reference, the background, for something more important, I believe. It is through these ordinary day-to-day encounters of accompanying the refugees to his doctor's appointment, showing him how to save money on groceries, etc., that you start to build a relationship with her. You start to get to know him, and she eventually becomes a friend. These encounters are what I call the God encounters. In these encounters, there is a possibility of transformation if you allow it. When I was a full-time volunteer at Romero House, a welcome center for asylum seekers in Toronto, I helped the asylum seekers with their basic needs. Through these actions, I was getting to know them just by talking with them. In effect, it was in those simple interactions where we were just present to each other, where it was no longer a social worker and an asylum seeker, but Norbert and Kilambi or Yolanda or Said, that I was creating those God encounters without really realizing it. I was dealing with a lot of French-speaking African asylum seekers. They eventually started to call me le grand brûlé, the great burnt one. I didn't understand why they were calling me that, so they explained to me that in their culture, le grand brûlé refers to a black person who, when his skin is burnt, turns white. So I was actually a black person like them whose skin had been burnt. I understood that they considered me a part of them. Therefore, it is in these God encounters that the integration works both ways. The other transforms you as you transform him. All that to say that one of the key elements in the mission of the Jesuit Refugee Service is accompaniment. And we've heard accompaniment over and over again, but it's so crucial. And the Canadian Private Sponsorship Program is all about accompaniment. So, what is this Canadian Sponsorship Program? It is a program that allows community groups, parishes, groups of 5 individuals to sponsor refugees. These sponsors commit to looking after a family of refugees for 1 year. They must find housing for them, provide them with enough money to cover their basic needs, orient them to the local neighborhood, assist them with government forms, help them enroll in language classes, help them find jobs, etc. They must also raise the necessary funds, which is usually about 25,000 Canadian dollars, which translates to maybe 15 American dollars, 15,000 I mean, depending on the size of the family, or they must show they have a sufficient income. They can actually name the refugees they want to sponsor as long as the named refugees have their UNHCR document. There are also very large organizations, such as dioceses, that are sponsorship agreement holders, for short SAWs. These sponsorship agreement holders have a special agreement with the government. This means that a SAW can sponsor many refugees per year. Usually, a SAW will work with an individual in Canada who wants to sponsor a family member abroad who is a refugee. The SAW acts as a guarantor for the individual who may not have the necessary funds or income to sponsor in a group of 5. But the SAW would still expect the individual to contribute financially for most, if not all, of the expenses for the sponsored family. JRS Canada is a sponsorship agreement holder in Quebec. So you can see that there is a potential for many people in Canada to accompany refugees. The program has been so successful lately that there is a large backlog of sponsored refugees waiting to come to Canada. Now, welcoming the other is a commitment to accompanying the other. This may seem extraordinarily simple, but it is very profound at the same time. Think of this question. When was the last time you spent time with one of the least of your brothers or sisters, a refugee, a homeless person, a prisoner, someone who is handicapped or elderly, other than to perform a service? Of course, the Jesuit Refugee Service doesn't only accompany refugees. We are also there to offer services. Our mission consists in accompanying and offering services and in defending the rights of refugees and of people who have been forcibly displaced. JRS works pastorally among refugees and the communities which welcome them by offering an extensive program of rehabilitation and of supportive activities. In Quebec, first and foremost, we have the sponsorship service that I just mentioned. Refugees arriving in Quebec via our service benefit from home visits, conversation groups, and psychosocial integration groups. The home visits give us the opportunity to create a trust relationship with the newly arrived refugees, which then allow us to discover their needs. Thanks to the bond of trust that is created, refugees are more likely to share their feelings about what happened in their country of origin and what they are experiencing in Quebec. We also organize conversation groups in collaboration with school boards so that the refugees can put into practice what they are learning. One of the participants, a father, told us, "The best time of the week is the 4 hours of conversation because the whole family participates." Finally, we offer a workshop composed of several sessions on the transition experienced by refugees when they arrive in Canada. The topics covered are culture shock, emotions experienced at arrival in Canada, the feeling of guilt for having left family and friends behind, etc. One of the participants commented, "Because of these meetings, I began to respect my tears, my anxiety, and my sadness. I found a place where I could share my deepest feelings without any shame for being so fragile. I have become patient with my wife and children and with myself." Now, where do we go from here? We have welcomed the stranger through these God encounters, but where does that lead us? We have made a friend. We have gotten to know him. We want to help her out even more. She tells us about her family members that are still abroad. We would like to sponsor them as well. However, the government has imposed a moratorium on new applications for privately sponsored refugees. We find out more about this moratorium and the number of refugees that will be admitted this year compared to the backlog of refugees whose applications are being processed. We also find out that the number of displaced people worldwide keeps growing. We ask ourselves, how is Canada and how are Canadians responding to this growing need? He also starts to tell us stories about his country, things we don't hear in the news. We start to think that the mainstream media may not be giving us the full picture or even the correct picture. We start to ask ourselves, why are there refugees coming from Syria, South Sudan, Burundi, etc.? Everybody knows the adage, give somebody a fish and he'll eat for a day. Teach him how to fish and he'll eat for a lifetime. A Jesuit friend of mine added a twist to that by saying, and what if the fish are poisoned and you find out that there's a factory upstream that is polluting the water? People continue to leave their countries. Why? There is war, there is environmental devastation, there is gang warfare. But what is behind these situations? That's where, as faith-based organizations, we also need to go. I started to ask people within the Syrian refugee sponsorship groups, what are their needs? With what can I help them? The most popular answer was, we want to know more about the underlying issues regarding the war in Syria. So I organized information sessions with history professors who could talk about the historical factors that led to the current situation. Now that we have educated ourselves, now that we know why the fish are being poisoned, what do we do about it? The following passage is a quotation from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops on Catholic Social Teaching. I quote, "Catholic social teaching is a central and essential element of our faith. Its roots are in the Hebrew prophets who announced God's special love for the poor and called God's people to a covenant of love and justice. It is a teaching founded on the life and words of Jesus Christ, who came to bring glad tidings to the poor, liberty to captives, recovery of sight to the blind," Luke 4:18-19, "and who identified himself with the least of these, the hungry and the stranger," Matthew 25:45. Catholic social teaching is built on a commitment to the poor. This commitment arises from our experiences of Christ in the Eucharist. End of quote. It is therefore crucial not only to accompany the poor, but also to defend them. We must ask our governments, in light of the increasing numbers of displaced people, to increase the numbers of refugees we take in. We must also speak the truth about our government's direct or indirect involvement that leads to the displacement of people across the world, and ask that they support peace efforts. In the end, we must close down the factory that is poisoning the water and the fish. Thank you.
All right, so let's take about 2 or 3 questions,
Thank you. I'm Susan Rogers. I taught anthropology and Southeast Asian studies here at Holy Cross for a number of years. For the last 4 years, I've been a member of the board and volunteering for Worcester Refugee Assistance Project, which works with our small Burmese refugee community in Worcester. But I'm also beginning to do research on refugee narratives, and I've been reading the anthropology scholarship on the kind of new anthropology scholarship on refugees carefully, and there's a theme there that I'm not hearing here, and I wonder if you could respond to it. Much of the kind of best anthropology work, such as Iwa Ong's Buddha's Hiding, which is a study of Khmer refugees in California, document how refugees living in the United States are trying to contest, to object to the category of refugees as being needy, as being in need of services, and often this is coded behavior. They won't come right out and say, oh, it's really insulting to be seen as somebody who is in need of services, but they have different strategies of doing that. And in my volunteer work with the Burmese refugees, I've found that is so true, and it's so effective. I don't know whether we'd categorize this as accompaniment or whatever, but I've found it so useful to our growing friendship, me and some of the Burmese refugees. When I teach them in English conversation hours, or I also do wrap some U.S. citizenship classes, to give them opportunities to teach me. I'll give you one example and see if this resonates with any of this theologically inspired work with refugees. Every Tuesday, I do an English conversation hour with a 42-year-old Burmese refugee. And after we had launched into this a couple weeks, she started to insist on cooking me lunch. And I said, no, I know the family doesn't have much money. And I said, no, I'll make a point of eating first, and then I'll come to your house and we can begin with our English conversation hour. And she's really stubborn, and so she insisted, no, I'm going to feed you lunch. And so she has been, and luckily I had the good sense to say yes, and so now I'm benefiting from the entire Korean cuisine, which is wonderfully delicious. But that sense that if you're encountering a refugee, you somehow break through the, I think, very pernicious stereotype of refugees as being in need of services, and let them teach you something in a genuine way, or let them provide a service to you. Every week she's giving me delicious Southeast Asian food. And I just wonder if any of you are familiar with that anthropological literature about how refugees often very much resent the category of needy refugee, and think about strategies that can help break that down.
I can start. Absolutely, I can start. A couple of things, and I think there's a difference in terms of the refugee journey when we encounter refugees, for example, who are newly arrived in their host country, are literally just fleeing from a conflict, for example, and have nothing on, with them or very little with them. That's one sort of need that we're trying to fulfill, and I think from the refugee perspective, they are in need and they are appreciative of the assistance. I think a resettled refugee in the United States, we've tried to make an effort actually to identify any JRS educated refugees in the U.S. to try to hear their stories and engage with them here in the U.S. and try to share their story as much as possible. And many of them, absolutely, they are former refugees. To identify as a refugee is not what they prefer. They are a former refugee, and I think even that distinction is something critical that we need to think about. They are no longer fleeing for their lives. They're in a safe place. They're building their lives, rebuilding their lives, and we need to acknowledge that. So absolutely, I think we would agree with that. But just to acknowledge that there's also sort of a journey that a refugee does take, and it's very different from the very early stages of that journey to where hopefully many of them can arrive. But again, it's different in every case.
I'll just share one story. I was at Canisius High School in Buffalo, and they had asked me to come up and be part of a week around understanding more the crisis of the humanitarian crisis around refugees, but how Buffalo was responding as a city. And my first suggestion was, are there any organizations that y'all work with that have somebody who's been resettled in Buffalo and there for a while that could come and share their story with the students? And so I co-presented really a kind of a facilitated conversation with a Somali woman who had been in Buffalo for 17 years, longer than most of the high school students had been alive, right? She was as much Buffalo as they were, as far as I was concerned. But she shared, and I think the desire to do research from the college in Buffalo is why I wanted to mention this. She shared the story of the community that she's become a part of, not just Somali resettled refugees, but a number of refugees from different parts of Africa and the world, and the businesses that they've established in this area of West Buffalo that was fairly abandoned, and as the city contracted, saw incredible disinvestment. The houses that they've bought and the value that that's grown, and so there's a story of the contributions that this large refugee community has made in Buffalo. But furthermore, individually, she was volunteering with the organization that the high school contacted to work with newly arrived refugees who were pregnant. Maybe not in their first pregnancy, but we're going to have their first pregnancy in the U.S., to explain to them what the healthcare experience system, prenatal care was like, and to answer questions and accompany them from her own experiences of having birthed 2 children here in the U.S. in Buffalo. So I think there's a richness, absolutely. I'm not familiar with anthropological literature, but from experiences and drawing out those stories, I think, yeah, there's lots to benefit there. Thanks for your comment.
And do we have another question out there?
I'm Fan Mei. I'm from Boston College, and I have a question specifically regarding the sponsorship program in Canada. To my knowledge, the sponsorship program was only designed for 1 year, and I think it's one of the most efficient way to bring people into the country and resettle them. But I was wondering if you keep track of people who enroll in the program after the 1 year, like after the program ends, especially how to promote their independency of the refugee families, especially with their language barrier and also cultural difference. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, as you mentioned, the legal requirement once you sign on is for a year. And so any group, whether it is a parish or a group of 5, is responsible legally for 1 year. Now, what happens after that year, obviously there are relationships that have been formed, and so the people will still continue to be present and be friends with that family, even well after the year is gone. I know people that had sponsored Vietnamese refugees, and they are now in relationship with their sons and daughters. And so the relationship is still maintained after many years, depending. Sometimes it only lasts for a year, and that's it, and there's no more connection between the two. In terms of follow-up, there's no specific follow-up done by the organization or by the government or anything like that, in terms of seeing them through whatever has happened in the past year or in the following years. So that might be something to improve upon, but there are organizations, settlement organizations that can help after that first year, even if the family or the sponsorship group has ended its first year with the refugee family. There's still that possibility of working with settlement organizations.
We'll take one more question.
Hi, Maria Rodriguez from the College of the Holy Cross, and I want to pick up on the last idea about the poisoning the fish, as well as the notion of hope that Mark spoke about. People keep going back, they keep trying, they will return, they will try again. In political science, we have this notion that globalization and global capitalism that we're all part of is a key driver of what we see, less refugees, but certainly immigrants, and the fact that if services and goods are being more freely circulating within the globe, then people will be part of this process inevitably, which then poses a gigantic constraint to your efforts. In a way, there's pressure to stop that flow. On the other hand, we're all part of this gigantic system that is pushing the circulation. So sometimes it feels like you're drying ice. So I was wondering how you would respond to that.
Excellent question. What I can say is there's this report that was done by François Crépeau, who is the special rapporteur for the UN on migration issues for Europe. And he basically was saying that we need to, well, first of all, he was saying that inevitably, and he was talking specifically about Europe, there's going to be people that will be going to Europe because there are jobs there. And that's why there's the pull factor well, there's push factors, but the pull factor is obviously jobs. And you could probably say the same thing about Central Americans going to the States. And so instead of putting up borders and different problems in their way, why not regulate the migration flows? Why not have something like a visa that is good for 5 years and give them the opportunity to work during that first year, to as a trial period, to have them try to find work during that first year, and if they don't, they have to go back and then come back afterwards. And he was also saying that if they don't go back after that first year, then they kind of negate that possibility of coming back. So there are different ways that you could regulate it, but governments aren't listening to those kinds of proposals.
I'm not going to have a very well-informed political science response to the question, obviously. But it's funny, in the work that I've done with groups at the grassroots level, dealing with issues of immigration, for example, I've really been struck, and this is true also for Homeboy Industries in LA, I would say, as you confront these intractable problems and we come up against really large system-wide errors that are causing and perpetuating human suffering, I've been really impressed subtly by these organizations' intentionality of turning their concern inward and becoming much more aware of, hey, you know what? We want cheap tomatoes, we want cheap clothes. What are the consequences of that? And so, Homeboy Industries, they started this organic garden along the wall of the south-facing wall of Homeboy Industries building. And they're just saying, why can't we raise our own fruits and vegetables here, empower one another, teach each other the skills? And so you have this local intentional movement to, let's be very intentional about where we consume and how we're consuming and how we're cultivating economic relationships that otherwise, when they're unexamined, perpetuate some of the very crises that we confront the human suffering consequences of. So that's just an anecdotal way of saying that there's a turn inward as I've been involved with organizations that are dealing with these large intractable problems. I inevitably see the staff and the long-term volunteers there turn inward to how can we be more intentional about the relationships that we have economically, politically, civic relationships in our own community. And that's a wonderful thing, because then they're trying to model the kinds of communities that people would never feel pushed to migrate away from. They become very attractive and they become pull communities, but they're modeling the virtues that I think that we want to see more of in this world, rather than kind of uncritically just going to Walmart and buying their fruits and vegetables and clothes.
All right. On that note, I want to thank all our panelists and Mark Potter as our keynote for sharing their thoughts on principles and practice. So if you could join me for just giving them a round of applause. And our JUHAN fellows have a couple of announcements about what we're going to be doing next as campus delegations.
Hi, everyone. So the next session is the student delegation meetings, which is where student representatives from each college or university will gather to discuss how social justice issues are addressed on their respective campuses. It is our hope that student groups will be able to come away from this session with a plan of action to implement on their own campuses. At the 2015 JUHAN conference, the Holy Cross student delegation used this session to come up with a plan to create a group in which representatives from social justice groups on campus would come together to collaborate and communicate about campus-wide initiatives. This idea has resulted in the Social Justice Coalition on campus, which has successfully organized the campaign against microaggressions and helped to collect money for Haiti after Hurricane Matthew devastated the country. There's a JUHAN table in the back where Fairfield is representing. They're also involved in campaigns like this, and there's going to be a Humanitarian Action Week in November. So if you're interested in getting involved, they have information about that. So please take this next session to brainstorm what kind of initiatives you might bring to your own campus to build upon all that you've learned so far at the conference.
So there are a few questions to help guide your discussion that could be found on page 13 of the conference program. There you can also find the room numbers in Hogan reserved for your student delegation. Please note that some rooms will have multiple colleges and universities, but you can also feel free to use this space to meet with your delegation. There are markers and chart paper here if you would like to use them, and we recommend that you elect a note taker and a facilitator to make the session run a bit more smoothly. If you are not a part of a student delegation, Hogan 304 is available as a contemplative space if you are interested. If not, then feel free to take a walk on campus or browse the available material on the tables that you're sitting, or you feel free to spend this time and take this time use it however you wish. Right now, Isabel will now make a few announcements, and then there will be a short break, at which point the student delegation sessions will start. Thank you.
Thank you, Maddie and Sahara. So I just wanted to talk quickly about the community partner visits. The first thing is that the Worcester Interfaith visit is no longer going to happen. So the two folks that signed up for that, I moved you to the Warm visit, which is a similar sort of learning experience. But let me know if that's you want to go do a different one. So the first group that's leaving is the Family Health Center group at 12:15, and you'll leave from right outside. Each group has a student leader, so Marilee is the Family Health Center leader, so find her and she'll take attendance and get you there and back. The Hadwin Park group will leave next at 12:40. So if you're in that group, the student leader is Fumi, who's back there, so find her and get on the bus with her. Then the Accentria group's gonna leave at 1:15. The group leader for that group is Jeff, so find him and get on the bus with him. And the Warm group will leave at 1:30, and Jerome over here is the student leader, so find him and get on the bus with him. And then the Raw group is meeting on campus at 2 p.m. in Hogan 320, which is back there. And I do want to point out, if you are going on one of the first couple of visits, you'll be back in time to catch most or all of the Raw demonstrations, so please go right into that, even if you're not on the list. You're welcome to come in and see that happen. And then the other thing is lunch. It's going to be box lunches, so you can grab them. They're going to be put out in the tables out in here, so grab 2 or 3. We have a lot, so please take a couple, and then you can take them with you on the bus, or you can eat them here, but please be sure to get a lunch. The ones in the yellow bags are the ones with people who have different dietary restrictions. If you are staying on campus, remember, find me and give me your access card. And then the other thing is we'll, at 3:30, most of the groups will be back. We'll have snacks here, and then we'll meet again. Please be here at 4:15. We're excited to welcome our provost to talk a little bit more about JUHAN and Holy Cross, and then we'll spend some time to share our learnings together. So that's kind of the afternoon. I'll be out at the table if you have questions about the visits, and we hope that you enjoy them. They're very intentionally structured to help you think about how can you do this encountering and accompaniment that we've talked about. So enjoy your delegations, enjoy the visits, and let us know if you have any questions. And thank you again, panel.